Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Thursday, August 13th meeting of the Committee on Policing and Community Engagement. I'm Vice Mayor Emily Duncan, and I will be facilitating our meeting this evening. So I'd like to call the meeting to order. And the next item on our agenda is how you can participate as members of the public. We have had in the past some issues with our hands up feature, but if you are online and you want to communicate with us, if you're having any problems with your hands up feature, just send us a chat and we will have the ability to promote you to speaker and you can talk with the committee. Members of the public may also share their written comments with the committee staff in advance of the meeting by sending them to communications@unioncity.org. Comments sent into the committee staff in advance will be read into the record during the meeting. This meeting will be streamed live on the City of Union City Facebook page. However, we will not be monitoring or accepting public comments through Facebook during the meeting. With that, could we have the roll call, please, Emma?
Vice Mayor Emily Duncan.
Here.
Councilmember Pat Gakoskos.
Here.
Commissioner Melissa Schwen-Mallory.
Here.
Commissioner Michelle Williams-Smith.
Here.
And Commissioner Jonathan Petty.
Here.
Okay, we're all here and accounted for. So next on our agenda is public comment. This is an opportunity for any member of the public who'd like to speak for up to 3 minutes. At this time, you can either try the hands up feature or you can send us a chat. And just for the record, there will be another public comment section later in the meeting. So Emma, do you have any hands up or comments or individuals who'd like to speak?
There are no hands up and nothing in the chat at this moment.
Okay. Thank you. All right, we're going to move on then to unfinished business. As I mentioned earlier, if we receive written comments from between meetings, we will bring them to the meeting and read them into the record. I believe tonight we have 2 comments that we have received since our last meeting, and Lauren's going to read those for us into the record. Lauren?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to start with the first comment. We should not defund the police or reallocate funds. Just because there are a few racist cops, it does not mean that all or most cops are racist. It is the police who keep the vast majority of people, especially the poor, the minorities, who cannot afford to live in safe gated communities. The police put themselves in harm's way so that people who can't defend themselves are safe. In fact, if anything, we should defund other services of the government that are not absolutely necessary, or those that can be served by contracting to private companies who can be fired if they don't do a good job. In the era of COVID, I know of many colleagues who are out of a job. Can we cut administrative salaries, prune waste in other areas, and leave the police alone? It is truly the very rich, the 1%ers, who don't need the police. They can afford private security guards. The rest of us, poor staffs, need the police. If anything, please increase the funding for the police. So that's one comment. And the next comment. I am totally against defunding the police or having the funds from robust policing to social programs. This has been tried in other places with disastrous results. Police in Union City are amazing. They know the community and work well to keep crime down. If the state of California had not screwed with law enforcement and said $900 and less, no need to report, we would have a safer place. I am not sure why people imagine that less police is better. And most of the Antifa and BLM people are white and have a nice trust fund and live far away from Union City. So taking their input for our city is ridiculous and dangerous. I am all for better training for officers and decoupling money from public sector unions to politicians. There should be a law that says no public sector unions can donate to politicians. That is the only way bad cops or bad employees, racist cops or racist and useless government employees will be rooted out. Now the unions and politicians are in bed together and they do not even bother to investigate any complaints of bad behavior of cops or government employees. This defund the police is pretending that the police are bad when the actual bad actors are union bosses and elected officials ganging up to protect bad behavior. I say defund the public sector unions and defund the politicians and fund the police even more. Less police affect all of us, but more than anyone, the poor and minority community is most affected by less police. And that concludes written comments.
Okay, thank you very much. And those comments will be posted at the committee website if anyone is interested in rereading them in more detail. All right, then we're going to move on to new business. And tonight we have a special guest who's been invited to join us. He will be our only speaker this evening, and it will be a conversation with our police chief, Jarrett Renetti. And I just want to say that in inviting the chief to this meeting, we put together all of the questions and issues that have come before this committee over the last 7 weeks, and we've given him a very long list of topics and concerns to speak to. Hopefully he has been able to collect enough information to answer those, but if there are any issues that any of you have that he hasn't been able to speak to, know that we can get him that information. He'd be happy to get back to you. And after he's completed his presentation, he has agreed to stay with us for a while and take a few questions. So with that, let me give the floor to our police chief. Jarrett, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me tonight. I really appreciate all the leadership from the subcommittee and all the contributions from the residents. I truly value the feedback thus far. I would also like to thank Sergeant Rodriguez, Lieutenant Steve Mendez, and Officer Justin Noyd. It's tough for police officers to really let their guard down and become vulnerable. And I thought they did a really nice job sharing their personal feelings and thoughts to really uncover the individual behind the badge. So I wanted to thank Justin, Steve, and Stan. This evening, I'm going to do my best to answer many questions. I've compiled the following themes to consolidate the questions. So I'll do a little brief introduction of myself. We'll talk a little bit about department policies and 8 Can't Wait. I'll touch on Campaign Zero and the police scorecard. Then we'll get into demographics and recruiting, department training standards. We'll talk about mental health service calls, use of force and our policy and statistics, the defund the police movement, UCPD culture, and then a little bit about reform. So without further ado, we have quite a bit to talk about. First, a little bit about me. So I was born and raised really right on the border of Union City and Fremont. I lived right off Dakota Road and Fremont Boulevard my whole life. Many wonderful memories with family and friends that live in the city. Obviously, the one thing that always comes to the mind is drive-in theaters with my grandmother having me hide in the trunk of the vehicle as we were coming to the Union City drive-ins. I'm married to my wife, Janine. I have 3 amazing kids, Gianni, Ava, and Viana. They range from 7 to 11. They're still youngsters, and I really should say I have 5 because I have 2 pups at home, Vito and Elsa, that are a part of our family too. I've been with Union City for over 20 years. I've had the opportunity to work most assignments in the police department. I do have to say, since it's come up a little bit in the conversations, that the one that I probably enjoyed the most in my career was the COPS unit. I was a part of the COPS unit for 4 years. Actually, Steve Mendez and I were partners. I think the reason why I loved the COPS unit so much was the opportunity to just engage the community. I wasn't running from call to call. I was just looking for people to talk to. And if there was somebody working in their yard or washing their car, I would stop and talk and introduce myself. If there was kids playing in the park, I would stop and hang out with the kids. I knew just about every business in my side of town that I worked. They all had my business card, and that's how I found work to do as a cops officer. As I heard the feedback from our community, I redirected my focus to long-term problem-solving solutions for the people that lived in the city. So it was truly a highlight in my career. I'd like to start going over our policy, and 8 Can't Wait, to give you an understanding of how our policy relates to these recommendations. The first is to ban carotid and strangleholds. UCPD does not train or authorize the use of carotid or chokeholds. This is nothing new for UCPD. We haven't authorized those or trained on those since I've been here, which has been over 20 years. One thing that we did recently change was we stopped allowing the use of any form of hold or tactic to prevent a person from swallowing drugs. We used to have a policy that would allow to prevent that for overdose purposes, prevent destruction of evidence, but at this time, we no longer authorize that. If somebody does swallow drugs, we will treat it like a medical emergency, but we will not try and prevent it. The next one is require, and one thing I'd like to mention, all of these 8 Can't Wait and our policies are available. If you go to the city website and then click on the police department, and then you go to action items and policy, you could view this in greater detail. The next one is require de-escalation. 8 Can't Wait is a national standard, and it's important to know that the state of California has laws regarding de-escalation. So currently, under Senate Bill 230, there was laws to require it, but our policy also covers it, that these techniques are really the core of our ongoing police training. We use de-escalation in pretty much all we do to try and eliminate the use of force. The next is exhaust all alternatives before shooting. Our department policy requires officers to evaluate reasonable options, resources, and techniques when determining the need to use their firearm. Officers are only authorized to shoot when there is an imminent threat of death or serious injury to the officer or another person. The next one is duty to intervene to stop excessive force. Our policy mandates a duty to intercede, but also to report excessive force to a supervisor. The next is ban shooting at moving vehicles. Our policy restricts shooting at moving vehicles to situations when no other reasonable means are available to avert the threat. Our policy actually goes into more specific detail that says basically get out of the way of an approaching vehicle instead of discharging your firearm whenever possible. And we got 2 more here. The next is require use of force continuum. UCPD requires our officers to only use the amount of force that is reasonable and appears necessary given the facts and totality of the circumstances. So basically, the type and level of force should be reasonable and appropriate to the threat or crime. And the last one is require comprehensive reporting. UCPD requires our officers to document all uses of force. Every use of force, whether it's a display of force, so if an officer points a firearm or points a taser, that has to be documented just the same if it's an actual physical force. Then it's reviewed by the employee's supervisor and manager to ensure it was within policy. So in summary, our policy is consistent with 8 Can't Wait, and it really has been consistent with these recommendations for many years. Other than the preventing subjects from swallowing drugs, that portion of the policy, everything has been the same for an extended period of time. The next area I'd like to talk about, it came up a couple of times in prior subcommittee meetings, was the police scorecard. It was through Campaign Zero, and during the meetings, it was mentioned that the Union City Police Department received an F on the scorecard. Obviously, I was disappointed with that rating, but I looked into it further and wanted to provide a little bit of feedback. So the scorecard was created by a criminal justice advocate and a police reform group. And what they did was they took 100 police departments in California and they reviewed those departments. 70 of the 100 departments that they reviewed received an F. That made me feel a little bit better. 90 of the 100 police departments received a D or lower. So when I started to research it, I wanted to find out what the criteria was for their rating. And the first criteria that they rate on is the number of less lethal and deadly force incidents and the number of incidents that left persons seriously injured or killed. We received an F in this category. During the rating period, they reported we had 45 incidents where an officer used a weapon on a suspect, or 2 incidents where an officer discharged a firearm. When they say weapon, they're referring to an officer using one of the tools they're given and trained with to protect themselves and others, like a baton, a taser, pepper spray, things of that nature. Those use of force numbers are then divided by the number of arrests made by UCPD, which then results into a percentage. And that percentage gave us the failing grade. Unfortunately, the factors that led up to each use of force, whether it was a baton, a taser, a firearm, those were not reviewed or considered. They only looked at the numbers. So for example, UCPD officers conducted a traffic stop. This was in 2018. It was on the rating criteria. The suspect shoots at the police officers before they even exit their vehicle. The officers discharge their service weapons in response to the attack and shoot the suspect. This contributed to our failing grade because the officers discharged a firearm and injured a suspect. This problem or this process of grading use of force without considering contributing factors is very problematic. The next one is frequency officers made misdemeanor nonviolent arrests compared to violent arrests. UCPD received a B in this category. Well, a B minus, a B minus. Part of the reason why was because we had 8 homicides during this rating period, and we solved 6 of the 8 homicides. This is far higher than the national clearance rate for murder, which helped our score. However, we were penalized for the number of misdemeanor arrests we made, including the number of drug arrests. I presume they penalize departments in this area because the thought that drug and some misdemeanor violent crimes don't necessarily have a victim and they're not violent. I personally disagree with the philosophy because the job of the police is to uphold the law, all the laws, and if certain crimes, such as drug crimes, should not be or should be decriminalized, then it's a responsibility of the legislature, not the police. Furthermore, a quick example that penalized UCPD or would penalize UCPD was last year. In 2019, we increased our drug enforcement in the city, and it was due to an uptick in overdoses. We had 8 overdoses, so 8 of our residents died of drug overdoses, and it was primarily due to fentanyl. But according to the police scorecard, the increased police enforcement on those dangerous drugs deserves a failing grade because it's a misdemeanor, nonviolent crime. And then the last area that we struggled in the police report card was complaints found in favor of citizens. This was due to UCPD reportedly conducting 16 investigations on employees. This was during a 3-year period, 2016 to 2018. 6 were allegations of discrimination, and 2 were allegations of crimes committed by police. Since the investigations were not found in favor of the civilian or in support of the allegations, the police department received a failing grade. This grading dimension, again, doesn't take into consideration any evidence. It doesn't consider body-worn camera footage, which is a requirement in Union City. It doesn't consider witness statements, truthfulness of involved parties, or so on. Plus, one thing to remember is anytime we have a complaint or an internal investigation, often those investigations are part of discovery in federal trials or lawsuits. This means the thoroughness and integrity of our investigation can be reviewed by a judge, attorneys, and potentially jurors. I believe the point being made is if the police department do not find their employees at fault, it suggests there's a lack of accountability. What's interesting, though, is last year in 2019, we had 6 investigations on employees, and 3, or half of those investigations, resulted in dispositions against the employee. So the fact of the matter is it's not a lack of accountability as much as basing findings from investigations on facts and evidence versus allegations only. Because of the lack of comprehensive data and misleading kind of interpretation of facts, in my opinion, I feel the police scorecard is not really a great source of information. The next area I wanted to touch on is department demographics. This also includes a little bit of recruiting strategies. The experience at UCPD right now, we're a very young department. Approximately half of our department has less than 5 years experience. And almost 75% of our department has less than 15 years of experience. So very young department. I would like to touch on education. I'm a big supporter of education. Education is extremely important, and I'm proud to report almost 48% of our department has a college degree, which is actually pretty consistent in the city. The city's residents with a college degree is 47%, so it's pretty right on. Gender, 72% of our police department is male, and 27% of our police department is female. In regard to race, 44% of our department is white in comparison to 16% in the city. 33% of our officers are Hispanic in comparison to 21% in the city. 17% of our officers are Asian in comparison to 53% in the city. And lastly, 5% of our department is Black in comparison to 5% in the city. It is important to me that we strive to have a department that does reflect the demographics of those we serve. We work to achieve this goal by really learning the best recruiting strategies and using targeted recruiting, community engagement, volunteer assignments, and youth employment opportunities to attract candidates who live in Union City. Union City is like most police departments in California. We do not require officers to live in the city they work. But the good news is currently almost about a third of our employees do fit into the categories of either went to school here, grew up here, or are currently living here. So about a third of our department meets those criteria. To diversify our department, some examples of targeted recruiting that we've done as a police department is job fairs. We've participated in the Gurdwara Temple Job Fair. We've also participated in the Sikh Sports Festival, the St. Anne's Festival, the annual Kabaddi tournament, and also the Our Lady of the Rosary Festival. Also, our employees participate as instructors at James Logan High School. We currently have 4 UCPD employees that are primary or assistant instructors at the school. It's a great way for our officers, detectives, and sergeants to work directly with the youth at Logan and get them introduced to the profession of law enforcement. We also have several programs for youth in the department. Some of these provide opportunities that really invite the youth into the police department, such as internships, volunteer programs, and employment opportunities. We have one of the best, in my opinion, volunteer Explorer posts in the state. Our program fluctuates in size, and at times we have up to 40 youth participants, and they range from 14 to 21 years old. And over the last, since we've been tracking it, 59 of our Explorers have either been hired as employees at Union City PD or been hired by other law enforcement cities. It's a pretty incredible accomplishment. For youth employment, we also offer cadet positions. These are positions that are part-time, and they provide law enforcement experience. They work in records, traffic, animal control, and fleet and equipment maintenance. 3 of the last 5 police officers we've hired were actually cadets at UCPD prior to being hired as officers. And finishing up in this section, some interesting information I wanted to share in regards to demographics of employees is the employees we've hired over the last 2 years. It's important to me that I make it really clear these employees were not hired because of their demographics. They were hired because they were the best, most highly qualified candidates. At the same time, though, it's great to see that our recruitment efforts, our internships, Explorer program, our cadet positions are working to identify highly talented, diverse candidates. So the following percentages I'm going to share with you are all the employees that we've hired over the last 2 years, which is about 15 employees. 53% of the new employees we've hired over the last 2 years have been female. 53%. 47% of the employees have been male. Okay, of the last 2 years, 7% of the employees we've hired have been white in comparison to 16% in the city. 38% have been Hispanic in comparison to 21% in the city. 38% have been Asian in comparison to 53% in the city. And 15% have been Black in comparison to 5% in the city. In addition, almost 60% of the employees we've hired over the last 2 years are current or former residents of Union City. I mention that because it's great to see that we're not only hiring the best candidates, but they are reflective of our community and represent our future leaders. The next section is mental health service calls. Mental health calls are extremely challenging for officers. These calls are typically involving subjects who are suffering from a mental health crisis, and it's not uncommon for the subjects to be dangerous or to be armed with a weapon. In the last 2 years, 2018 and 2019, UCPD has responded to almost 600 emergency mental health emergencies. We average around 20 to 25 a month and about 275 per year. In 2018 and 2019, 96% of the roughly 600 emergency mental health calls we responded to were resolved successfully. When I say successfully, I mean we responded, de-escalated, evaluated, and had the subject transported to a hospital to get help with no use of force. 96% is a pretty remarkable number considering the factors often involved in these types of cases. In the 4% of the nearly 600 emergency mental health calls, we needed to use force to get the subject transported to a local hospital. Often the force was minor, such as holding arms or legs so EMS staff can safely secure the subject to a gurney. In the 4% where we did use force, not one of the 4% resulted in any serious injury. These statistical numbers are significant. Almost 600 emergency mental health calls, 96% resolved successfully where the subject was transported to the hospital for care, and only 4% with a controlled level of force resulting in no serious injury and safely getting a subject who was in a mental health crisis to a hospital for help. This level of success for a department is not a matter of coincidence. It reflects training, it reflects policy, it reflects procedure, all that support these types of results. As an example, UCPD requires all officers on patrol to be CIT certified. CIT stands for Crisis Intervention Training. It's a 1-week, 40-hour course specifically designed for these types of calls. It's not mandated by the state of California, but it is mandated by the Union City Police Department. Currently, every single officer at Union City PD on patrol, except for those in training, field training, are CIT certified. That's an incredible achievement for a police department. I would like to thank HRC Commissioner Michelle Williams-Smith. Commissioner Williams-Smith and I have worked together throughout the years to not only provide briefing introductions and training, but also to keep our officers supplied with mental health resource guides for members in our community. So I appreciate that collaboration over the years, Michelle. Thank you. Lastly, just because we've done remarkably well with these calls doesn't mean there's not a more appropriate way to handle these calls. I've been in contact with Fremont and Newark police chiefs regarding researching South County options that incorporate Alameda County behavioral health care services, a mobile evaluation team, and an MOU with Washington Hospital. We currently do not have those enhanced services coordinated in Union City, but are interested in researching those options for future deployment. Next, department training standards. Training is a very important component to our success. Police training is daunting, and it includes many layers of both local, state, and national, at both the local, state, and even national level. UCPD, like most law enforcement agencies in California, uses a regulations set forth by the California Commission of Peace Officer Standards and Training. That's POST. POST is our baseline. POST requires that certain training be met by law enforcement agencies on a continual basis. UCPD goes above and beyond the POST requirements. At UCPD, all training is defined and organized in a master training plan. This plan identifies all job classifications in the police department and then separates the training into three categories: mandated, which is state and federal law; essential, high priority; and then desired, which is preferred. How do we conduct training? There's several ways. The first way we train is through briefing training. Daily, officers, supervisors, and managers coordinate a training and briefing. The training is typically 15 to 20 minutes long and consists of a wide variety of topics. Often this includes debriefs of prior calls or working through practical scenarios that may arise on patrol. We also invite and receive training from different nonprofit and other organizations in the city related to domestic violence, child abuse, mental health services, and so on. Next, we train through daily training bulletins. We call them DTBs. It's a training system where employees review different policies and procedures on their own time. It's while they're at work, and they take a short test at the end to confirm they understand the subject matter material. In 2019, we had 266 policies and procedures issued for review and testing. In 2018, 325 policies and procedures were issued for review and testing. And in 2017, 315 policies and procedures were issued for review and testing. It seems like a lot of training, and it is, but it's because we have a lot of policy and procedure. At UCPD, we have 249 policies and procedures that make up 1,109 pages of guidelines. The training we do through DTPs is an additional 20 to 25 hours a year just on policy and procedure. The next is continued professional training. We call those CPTs. They're planned annual trainings we either host with department experts or have instructors teach. In 2020, this year, we have 80 hours of planned CPT training. The topics for this year are leadership, critical incident, TASER, arrest and control, de-escalation, firearms, force option simulator, implicit bias, racial and cultural diversity, responding to anti-Muslim bigotry, and officer wellness. As mentioned, there's significant focus in the areas of de-escalation, implicit bias, and racial and cultural diversity. On these topics alone, officers at UCPD are getting about 30 hours of training this year. I recently completed the racial and cultural diversity training. The class was actually taught online by Dr. Roberts, who was part of the Little Rock Nine, which addressed segregation back in the 1950s. Dr. Roberts was actually one of the 9 students who was escorted into school by the military when segregation was ruled unconstitutional. For me, the instruction was really powerful, and it included parts of history where law enforcement was directed to enforce segregation as a law. This is just a brief summary of the training. I wanted to mention it because it kind of helps illustrate the type of quality training we do receive. The last bit of training I wanted to touch on was regulatory training. These trainings occur in addition to briefing training, daily training bulletins, and continued professional trainings. Most of these are biennial, and they're regulated by the Penal Code, OSHA, or other regulatory bodies. Examples are like first aid, CPR, bloodborne pathogens, aerosol transmission diseases, terrorism, human trafficking, elder abuse, electronic crimes. It goes on and on. There's several regulatory classes that we also have to cover. So as you can see, training in the police department is a huge undertaking. We value the importance and recognize the need for training, especially to remain contemporary and progressive with today's policing needs. The next section is our use of force policy and statistics. Policy 300 is our use of force policy. It's about 8 pages long and can be viewed on the city website under Police Department and Transparency Portal. It's a long policy, but I wanted to give just a little kind of summary. The policy in a nutshell says officers shall only use that amount of force that reasonably appears necessary given the facts and totality of the circumstances known to or perceived by the officer at the time of the event to accomplish a legitimate law enforcement purpose. This is also supported by the California law 835 of the Penal Code. Use of force incidents are tracked in a system called Blue Team. So when an officer uses force, they not only are required to write it in the police report, but they have to enter it in the system called Blue Team. Blue Team, once it's entered, goes to their sergeant. Their sergeant then has the report, the body-worn camera video, and obviously policy to ensure everything is in line and correct. After the sergeant approves it, it then goes to the lieutenant. The lieutenant does the same review as the sergeant to ensure everything complies with policy. After the lieutenant approves it, it goes to our professional standards unit. The professional standards unit we call our PSU. They're a standalone unit in a different division. One of their responsibilities is tracking and accountability for the use of force. And when they receive use of forces, it's their job to maintain and keep everything updated. PSU also does quarterly audits. They do 4 audits per year. Each randomly selects a use of force incident. And what they do is they review the report, the video, they review policy for each of the random use of force incidents. And then they write a report that goes to the support services captain and then myself. In addition, PSU conducts an annual report that summarizes all use of force incidents. The report tracks a number of force incidents, the type of force, injuries, and other force data. This report goes to the support services captain and then it's forwarded to me. After I review it and approve it, I forward it to the city manager and the city council. Currently, this information is not shared on our website, but we are moving toward posting these reports for community review. When we talk about the use of force, it helps to understand some statistical data. UCPD had approximately 41,000 contacts last year. So in 2019, we made approximately 41,000 contacts. This includes traffic stops, pedestrian stops, consensual encounters, detentions, arrests, and so on. Of the roughly 41,000 contacts, 186 resulted in a use of force. This is 0.5% of police contacts that lead to force or that led to force. Or 99.5% of the contacts last year in Union City were peacefully resolved and resulted in no use of force. Of the 0.5% of contacts that resulted in force, 95%, this gets a little confusing, 95% of the 0.5% resulted in no injuries to the suspect. Of the remaining use of force incidents, which is 5% of 0.5%, none of those suspects suffered a major injury that required hospitalization. There were no incidents last year where an officer discharged their firearm either. Sadly, we did have one in custody death in 2019. It was our first in custody death in over 20 years. The subject was involved in a major injury traffic collision where he was not wearing a seatbelt and collided with multiple vehicles at a high rate of speed. Officers were dispatched to the scene to help. When they arrived, they found the subject had visible injuries. He was trapped inside the vehicle. He also appeared to be under the influence. After the officers helped the driver out of the vehicle, he attempted to run from the scene. He was ultimately pulled to the ground where he was detained. While detained and with fire and emergency medical services at the scene, the subject stopped breathing. The subject was transported to the hospital but passed away. An investigation was conducted by UCPD and the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. This type of investigation is common for all in custody deaths, and since he was handcuffed in our custody, it met that criteria. Both our investigation and the investigation of the district attorney found that the officers acted objectively reasonable. I'd like to read you just a quick brief summary from the district attorney's review of the case. We conclude that none of the officers involved in this incident are criminally liable. There is no evidence that any of the officers committed a crime related to the level of force used. Rather, their use of force appears to have been objectively reasonable given the level of the subject's resistance. Nor is there evidence of criminal negligence on the part of the involved officers. Finally, the subject's death was not proximately caused by the officer's actions. We will be releasing the body-worn camera footage of this incident in the upcoming months. The video footage will be available on the city website under Police Department and Transparency Portal. Lastly, regarding use of force incidents, I would like to mention it's one of the toughest topics for the community and the police. Unfortunately, some media portray the police in a bad light, giving the impression that all police do is use force, more specifically, excessive, inappropriate force. Use of force incidents are an ugly part of our profession. It's something we do our best through policy, procedure, and training to limit, but it still occurs. It is just important to remember use of force at UCPD makes up 0.5% of our contacts. 99.5% of UCPD contacts are resolved peacefully without force. It doesn't mean that we can't do better. It just helps to provide a little context to the subject. Next, I wanted to just touch briefly on defund the police and the movement. I wanted to speak on it because we have organizational challenges that I feel relates to the defund the police movement. I think most people who say defund the police are referring to more of a reallocation of funds versus eliminating police services. The concept of reallocation of police funds and the subsequent transfer of certain responsibilities from the police to other service groups probably makes sense for certain communities. However, it can't be a one-size-fits-all. I'd like to share a few challenges we face at UCPD making this concept difficult. There are 8 similar-sized agencies in our region. They have populations between 70 and 90,000. Currently, UCPD is the least funded police department per capita out of all 8 similar-sized agencies. Roughly, our police budget equals $360 per resident per year. The highest per capita cost for police services is $593 per resident per year, and the average cost per capita is $442 per resident per year. If UCPD was funded at the average per capita cost of these similar-sized departments, our general fund budget would increase by over $3 million. This is the equivalent of increasing our authorized staff by 12 police officers, which interestingly is the same number of officers recommended to be added to the force when the police department underwent an audit. On top of being the least funded, we have the second highest violent crime rate per capita of those same 8 similar-sized agencies. The violent crimes I'm referring to are murder, rape, robbery, and assault with a deadly weapon. To put our staffing and budget challenges into perspective, in 1999, UCPD had 18 more employees than we do today. We have reduced our total staff by 20% in 20 years. Some of those reductions have been within the last few years when we've reduced our police department by 5 officers. This resulted in disbanding our COPS unit, our gang drug task force, and also our school resource officer program. Our staffing challenges are also evident when looking at the Alameda County Police Average Staffing Ratio. This includes all police departments in Alameda County. In 2017, which is the last update I have, the police average staffing ratio in Alameda County was 2.1 police staff members to 1,000 residents. In Union City, the average is 1.3 staff members to 1,000 residents. That's nearly 40% less than the Alameda County average. Further, last year, 2019, patrol worked over 20,000 hours. This is patrol only. They worked over 20,000 hours of overtime to maintain service levels and address community safety needs. Much of this overtime is due to vacancies related to injuries, retirements, or personnel transfers to the police departments. So I share this information just to be candid that the concept of defunding or reallocating makes sense and is doable for some police departments. However, consideration to defund or reallocate is unique to each department based on many considerations. Is everybody hanging in there? I'm almost done. So UCPD culture, I received a great leadership question. The question was, how do I as chief affect officer attitude, increase officer empathy, and hold officers accountable when they lack empathy? I believe the answer to these questions is rooted in the organization's culture. As a chief of police, it is my responsibility to identify clear expectations and priorities. When I was sworn in, I spoke about one priority. It was very simple. The priority I mentioned was service from the heart. It's 4 words, but the meaning and impact is much deeper. I believe as police officers, we are sworn into service and given a badge that represents our authority to enforce the law. The badge and the authority it carries can be misconstrued as power. Yes, it gives you the power to enforce the law, but real power is not in the badge. I believe the fact that the badge is worn on our chest over our heart is for a purpose. The real power we have in this profession is under the badge. It is our heart. We can respond to calls, collect evidence, take statements, and submit cases to the DA. But did we do our job? Did we serve from the heart? And for me, to serve from the heart, we must serve with care, compassion, and empathy. So as chief, I believe I impact the entire organization by first being an example. Service from the heart starts with me. Not only how I treat all members of the community, but how I treat the men and women in the organization. It's how the leadership team treats the men and women in the organization. And it's how the men and women of the organization treat one another. Professionalism, respect, care, compassion, and empathy that occurs outside the police department is a direct reflection of those same values that are shared within the police department. And that's just the beginning. Service from the heart must also be indoctrinated in all we do. Hiring, evaluations, special assignment appointments, and promotions must all include a service from the heart review dimension. Every new hire, every evaluation, every appointment, and every promotion is ultimately approved by me. I have high expectations and want to ensure that service from the heart, the care, compassion, empathy I'm referring to, is not lip service, but it's core values we use to hire, recognize, reward, and promote members of UCPD. In regard to culture, hearing the feedback from Officer Noyd's service from the heart made me realize I need to do a better job as chief. I mention this because some of the feedback after he spoke was of surprise and of appreciation for having such a great officer at UCPD. The reality is that Officer Noyd's care, compassion, and empathy is not unique to UCPD. It's what makes our department special. And that is where I need to improve and do a better job of communicating these acts of kindness to the community. I just want to take a quick moment to highlight a couple. And to avoid embarrassment, I will not mention the names of the employees, as I know most officers, including Justin, I'm sure it was hard for Justin as well, prefer to do what they do in serving others without special recognition. The first is a call UCPD received regarding a homeless man. He was living out of his vehicle in an industrial area of UC. He was staying at several local businesses, and the employees were getting uncomfortable with the fact that he was there all the time. Officers went out, they made contact and had a conversation with the gentleman. They learned his story. The officers realized he was out of a job and his only family was in Southern California. He wanted to work but had limited clothing and didn't feel he could present himself in a professional way to get a job. The officers did not just kick him off the property. They really were compassionate. They heard his story, and then they began talking with other members in the police department to come up with an idea or a way they could help. Richard Valle at TriSet, who's helped us many times, was the person we contacted. And special thanks to Richard, because Richard offered the man a job, which really helped him get back on his feet. Ultimately, the man worked at TriSet for quite a while until he saved up enough money to where he felt confident and ready to move back to Southern California to be with his family. That is service from the heart. UCPD received a call of a vandalism. The officer arrived at the home to meet an elderly lady whose home was vandalized. Her home had been targeted and vandalized by suspects throwing eggs and, we'll just say, other items at her house. She had limited mobility and was on a fixed income. She had no family in the area and explained to the officer she did not know why she kept getting targeted. The officer took it upon himself to return to her home off duty with his power washer and other cleaning supplies to clean and return her home to its previous condition. The officer never shared his actions with anyone. We learned about it through the kind card the woman sent to the police department. That is service from the heart. A UCPD officer was parked one night on the outskirts of a Walmart parking lot during the winter months. It was Christmas time and it was about midnight. While writing a report in his vehicle, he noticed a family sitting a few stalls in front of him. The vehicle was fogged up and he saw two kids in the back window wiping the moisture off the rear window. The kids were about 5 and 7 and they were playing with two toys along the top of the rear seat. It was extremely cold, and he could see the car was not running. The officer got out of the car and contacted the occupants. It was mom and dad and their 2 children. He asked them why they were sitting in the car so long. He learned they were a homeless family and were staying in the Walmart parking lot because the store had a policy allowing the use of their lot. The officer, seeing the family with blankets and jackets on, pulled out his wallet, took out all the money he had, and gave it to the family. It was almost $200. He then said, "Take this money and please find a nearby hotel for the next couple of nights." That is service from the heart. UCPD was dispatched to a burglary at a residence near Logan High School. When officers arrived, they met up with an older woman. The woman, who was single and lived alone, she advised she'd been caring for her mom, who was in her 90s and lived in Oakland. The woman had not been home for 6 weeks, and when she arrived home, she found that her home was occupied by squatters. When the officers entered the home, they were shocked with the condition. The home was thrashed, and it smelled like urine and feces. Furniture and windows were broken. Walls and toilets were vandalized, carpet was stained and ripped, and just about anything and everything that was in a drawer or cabinet was removed, thrown around, or broken in the house. The woman was speechless and emotional. She had no means, financial or physical, to fix the damage. The officer at the scene advised the woman, "Don't worry, the police department, we're going to help you out with this." Members from the PD came together, over 30, non-sworn, sworn, police volunteers, and so on, to help the woman. They received donations from Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart, and many other stores. Over a course of 3 weeks, this woman's home was cleaned, disinfected, repaired, repainted, and accessorized with some of the nicer items, and given back to her in a better condition than before. Again, that is service from the heart. I share these stories and have more I can share to demonstrate Officer Noid's kindness is not a single example of an officer, as much as it is a further representation of culture that is special, culture that makes us proud, culture that is deep-rooted at UCPD. Lastly, I'm going to finish up with police reform, locally and nationally. What can we, as in the policing profession, do better? I'd like to start off by reviewing a few ideas I've identified over the last several weeks from listening to the subcommittee meetings and really reviewing community feedback. The first is we need to find ways to increase community engagement opportunities. We are stretched thin, but that can't be an excuse for not creating positive contacts and building relationships. Positive contacts are not a given in a profession that is only called when there is a crime, disturbance, or problem. But positive contacts are a must for building and maintaining trust and confidence with the community. We need to create a plan where we can better identify and maximize engagement opportunities for relationship building. I'd like to identify opportunities that can also be tracked and included in our evaluations or reports on ways we positively engaged our community. Another area we need to find a way to improve is quality of life issues. We need to come up with better long-term problem-solving solutions. Police officers currently do not have the discretionary time for these problems. And when I say quality of life issues, I'm referring to nuisance properties, homeless encampments, abandoned vehicle or property, blight, neighborhood mediation, municipal code compliance, and so on. In my opinion, whether it's through the police department or other city departments, we need to identify a service model that addresses these quality of life issues and long-term problem-solving solutions. In the past and during these subcommittee meetings, the COPS unit has been identified as a tried and true program. I am happy to work with the city manager to try and find ways, whether through state grants, federal grants, or other funding sources, to try and restate some of those services to the community. Next, data sharing. We need to improve our data sharing. Dr. Jonathan Petty, who is on this committee, asked me if our annual use of force report is available for easy access and review. And the answer is no. The reports are not available for easy access and review, but I feel they should be available. We can work with the city attorney to have these reports published. I believe it would build trust and confidence with the community if we shared more citizen complaint data, internal affairs data, call data, and use of force data. Next, early warning systems. UCPD does not utilize any software to analyze and alert on use of force trends. There are systems available to allow agencies to analyze, track, and report use of force data in order to identify officers who are displaying patterns or trends. The early warning systems will help identify if an officer needs more training or mentoring, or if an officer is in the wrong profession. We can research options to add this oversight measure to our current use of force process. The current process was what I talked about with sergeant review, lieutenant review, PSU, audits, and annual reports. And then the last one I wanted to mention for locally is I think we need to research alternatives for responding to mental health service calls. Currently, there is no South County mental health response team to assist and handle non-criminal, non-violent mental health calls. We can research options for a shared resource or response program with our neighboring South County agencies and Alameda County Behavioral Health Services. Nationally, I support national and state standards that prioritize the respect for life and the requirement to de-escalate when feasible in policy, procedure, and training. There are laws and standards in California. However, negative criminal incidents involving police officers that occur across the country have resounding impacts everywhere. We need national standards around use of force policies, procedures, and training. I support national and state reporting and sharing of use of force data. For example, a use of force database that collects accurate data to understand the totality of incidents, patterns, trends, versus relying on information like police scorecard. I support national and/or state standards for decertification of officers that violate the oath of office. There are currently consequences in California for officers to lose their retirement if they commit certain crimes, but nothing for decertification. Nationally, we need standards to prevent incompetence and/or dishonorable behavior. Nothing is more frustrating in this profession than bad officers. Lastly, I support national and state reform on a much larger scale. I believe police reform is a single piece of a much larger puzzle. I am a puzzle guy. I enjoy puzzles with my kids. However, it's extremely frustrating to be short one puzzle piece after hours of work, and it happens all the time. However, I feel the exact opposite is happening with police reform. We are trying to solve a puzzle with only one piece. Police reform is needed. However, police reform will not solve the socioeconomic and racial divides in our country. I am referring to a deep dive in reform, one that includes equal education, youth and family support systems, long-term mental health care services, substance abuse treatment services, rehabilitation and reentry programs, and equal opportunity programs. Each of these factors are essential pieces of the puzzle we are all trying to solve, but we can't solve it with only a single piece. In closing, I can't express how proud and honored I am to lead UCPD. I feel supported by an organization of incredible men and women who are willing to sacrifice everything, and I mean everything, for the service of others. I am also so thankful for the amazing support of our residents. Over the last few months, I can't articulate the appreciation I and the employees at UCPD feel for the love and care provided by our community. Moving forward, I hope the tragic death of George Floyd not only makes our country better, but our community better, that we look to one another as partners who are contributing toward the same common goal of listening, learning, and leading. I wanted to end with a quote that was given to me by a friend, Pastor Baker. I've used this quote more than once because it is so true, no matter who you are or what you believe. The quote is by Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief.
Welcome.
I think that you covered all the topics that we gave you, and I think you did an admirable job. I appreciate the level of detail and sincerity that you brought to us. But I might have missed some issues and topics as I was collecting the things that I heard. So I did commit to the committee that I would give them an opportunity to ask you a question or two if you have the time to stay with us for a few more minutes. Is
Absolutely.
that okay? Well, let me just go around and see if any of the committee members have additional questions. I know that I gave you 7 pages of questions, but I might have missed something, and I want to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to be heard. So, Melissa, let me start with you. Are there any additional questions you'd like to ask the chief? He seems to be in a very open mood tonight.
I appreciate that. First of all, thank you, Chief, for being here and speaking to us and being so transparent about the issues within the police force. So I had a couple things come up in my mind while you were speaking.
Sure.
And one is that I know you mentioned, let me make sure I say this correctly, the CIT training, is that right?
Yes.
Crisis intervention. So I was just curious, like, what topics are covered? I know mental health is, de-escalation is one of the topics, but are there other topics that are covered?
It really focuses on responding to mental health calls or people in crisis. It focuses on being a better communicator, using things like time and distance to de-escalate situations, how our tone, how our stance, how our movement can trigger situations, and it gives our employees tools to better manage those situations.
Okay, cool. And then, so you mentioned mental health situations, and something I've always kind of wondered, you did mention youth and family services, which we have that. I was just curious if you ever felt like there were calls where maybe if we had youth and family services, like go out and talk to them first if the police were maybe not necessary to go out there, right? Maybe it was a nonviolent situation and you could send somebody like that instead, or maybe there's room in the force for like a nonviolent situation group of people to be on call. You know what I'm getting at? To go out that don't have to be like, in all the gear and everything. They can just go out and talk to people. What do you think?
I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think there's a lot of opportunity to find ways that we can provide service that doesn't necessarily need to be delivered from a uniformed officer. So I'm absolutely open to ideas of using youth and family services or having a component of the police department that can be with an officer and maybe handle the contact and handle the transition, but have an officer present if needed. I'm open to any of those ideas.
Okay, and do you perhaps have any, we didn't ask for this ahead of time, it just came to mind, but do you have any data on what the percentage of calls would be that might be covered by alternative services?
Actually, I do. So what I did was I looked at the types of calls that could be handled by, say, like a civilian arm or a civilian staff where it didn't necessarily need to have an officer present. And what I did is I looked at calls Monday through Friday between the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. because I presume they wouldn't be on 24 hours a day, to get an idea of how many calls could they respond to instead of the police. And it worked out to about 2,000 calls per year, or roughly about 8 calls per day if they worked a Monday through Friday shift. So I was doing a little bit of that brainstorming and thinking what types of calls could free our officers up more so they have more discretionary time to do community engagement or do neighborhood patrols. And looking at that, it was about 2,000 calls a year if they worked Monday through Friday during normal business hours.
And did you say what percentage of the calls? I don't know how many calls there are per year, so.
Oh, yes. So we have about 41,000. I'm sorry, did I get cut off a little bit?
I didn't hear that number, so maybe
Okay, yeah. So I think my computer froze, but we have about 41,000 calls. About 2,000 calls Monday through Friday between 8 to 5 would be the calls that in an initial look would be appropriate to have, a civilian possibly handling instead of a uniformed officer.
Okay. Thank you, Melissa. Let's see, I'm moving along here. Pat, do you have any additional questions that you'd like to ask the chief? You're on mute. You're going to have to unmute yourself.
That was a wonderful report, Chief. Very detailed. And the main thing that I really like is the service from the heart. And people should know this because, especially with the George Floyd incident, that, people are looking at the police officers as killers or as bad guys, but at the same time, especially in our in Union City, we have I only hear positive comments or reactions from our community. My question is, but I'm going to say first that I was surprised or pleasantly surprised that police officers are handling 96% of mental health calls, because some people in the Black Lives Matter what do you call this one complaints are, instead of, we have to defund the police and provide most of the funding to mental health services. So I was surprised that your police officers are also handling 96%, and they were resolved peacefully, successfully. My question is, how do the police officers know? I know they have training, but when they are called to the to serve, when they are called to a house, for example, how do the officers determine that it's a mental health matter?
Typically, when we receive the call, the information provided by dispatch gives us the information that it's a mental health service call. We go, and in the numbers I provided, the nearly 600, that's for involuntary, meaning that the person is choosing not to go, but based on the criteria, we are having them go. So voluntary, meaning if somebody just wants to go to the hospital, those are not even included in that number, because voluntary, we might go and stand by and just make sure they have what they need to get transported, but we do not take reports or track voluntary requests to go to the hospital for mental health.
Okay. The second, I know you, a lot of several of our speakers have been mentioned about cops. And you mentioned that one also, that's with one of your favorite services, police services. Can you tell us if they can be brought back and why? Why or why not?
Yes, I am very passionate about the COPS unit. At this time, we just don't have enough resources in the police department to stand up a COPS unit. The COPS unit we had involved 1 sergeant and 4 officers. And currently, we're having challenges just to have enough officers on patrol with our minimum staffing. So if we took 4 officers from patrol and we moved them to a separate unit, it would impact us too significantly on patrol to be able to accomplish it. So we would have to look at ways to increase our resources enough to have officers back in the COPS unit dedicated to that program. Because for it to be successful, they can't be assisting on patrol. They can't be working different investigations. They need to be dedicated to that commitment of community policing and engagement 100% of the time. It has to be a full commitment. So we would need additional resources at the rank up officer to be able to stand that unit back up again.
Okay, and I also heard that without a cop serving, you have some, you do some contacts with the community, just like the AFI with cops. And then the people who you cited, I mean, the officers that you cited as serving from the heart. So that was a good, a good service that, it's also touch on the cops unit services that Union City is serving. So anyway, that's all for now, Chief. But but overall, thank you so much for your service, and thank you for the people that you lead. So good service. Thank you.
Thank you, council member.
Okay. So Jonathan, I know you sent in written comments. We did forward them, but if there's something that's come up since the chief's been talking, I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask any additional questions that may have come to your mind.
Sure, thank you. So, Chief, thank you for all the information you shared tonight and for answering all the questions that were sent to you all. What was it, 7 pages of them? Towards the end of your talk, you spoke about police reform, both national and local level. And this may be more of a question for a discussion later, but how do we initiate those police reforms that you mentioned? And I'm not going to go back through them. And how could we lead the national change here in Union City? So just thoughts for future.
Yeah, and I think for the local, what I tried to do when I was thinking of ideas was trying to find local reform ideas that were attainable, that were reachable. Obviously, you could have a lot of different ideas, but if they're things that you can't achieve, it's challenging. So I believe with some dialogue with the command staff, with the council and different members, we can incorporate some of these relatively soon into the police department. And in regard to how can we set the example for national change, is I really think by doing what we're doing right now. It starts with dialogue. It starts with listening. When we talk about listening, it's listening to different perspectives and then being open to learn. What do I need to do as a police chief to provide better service? Because if I'm not listening, I might be thinking I'm doing a great job or providing the right service, but it's not what the community wants. So once we learn, then I think we can lead. And the wonderful thing about being a good leader is that word travels fast, and it might start at a local, to a county, to a state. And I think by looking at these issues here in Union City and starting to implement things that are attainable, that we can track, I think they need to be measurable. We can start leading by example so others can follow.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And Michelle, I know your comments were forwarded to the chief also, but I thought I'd just check in with you and see if you had any additional questions that came up for you during the discussion.
Yes, hi, and thank you very much. You did a very good detailing report there, so I appreciate that a great deal. It took probably a great deal of time to get that all together. I just wanted to make sure I wanted to make sure I did hear something, or you said you needed to identify what we could provide for mobile crisis services in the South County. Did I hear that? Did you say that? I'm not sure.
Yes, what I said is I'd like to identify all the options that are available in South County and see how we can implement them into Union City.
Okay, I'll try to help you with that.
Thank you.
Okay, and then also for the reentry program, or you also need information on that as well? For if someone is reentering from, and you're talking about jail and coming back and reentering in the community?
Yes. So what I was referring to in regard to the larger reform approach is that as reentry, as an example, oftentimes if you take people that have spent time in prison and they're re-entering into the community, if you look at the way prisons are set up, they're based on segregation. I mean, as soon as you get into prison, you're immediately segregated. Oftentimes the crimes that occur on the streets are already occurring in the prisons. So the process of transitioning a person that has been in prison for an extended period of time and part of a segregated society in prison, how do we transition? I just think that the type of reform and discussions we're having with policing could happen with those other systems in the criminal justice realm.
Okay, and do you know of the programs that are available for reentry from leaving, like from Santa Rita to come back into the community?
Not well enough to speak on confidently. I'd have to research more to provide you information on that.
Okay.
What I would add to that on behalf of the chief is that there is a policing and social justice working group that has been established at the county level where they are looking at opportunities to look at that. And I know that our city manager, our mayor, and members of our police organization are at the table to hear how the county is looking at those larger issues, so that if there's an opportunity in Union City for us to leverage what they're doing countywide, we're there at the table with them, Michelle, to make sure that those programs get integrated as appropriate here.
Well, I also understand there are the reason why I was asking that question, because there are some reentry programs that are supposedly available. So that's why I was asking that question.
Yeah.
Okay. And then one of the other questions that I have, I'm glad that everyone has been CIT trained. The question that I had one other time is that, are the officers identifying themselves or wearing the pen that shows that they are CIT trained when they are going to a crisis, so that the family member knows that this officer has been CIT trained?
Currently, we do not wear the pin. We verbally, communicate that we are CIT trained and allow people, or at least share with people, our level of training and experience in that area, so they're confident with our ability to communicate with people in need.
Okay. And the last one I have is, some cities, and I'm not sure if Union City does the same thing, that when there is a call for a mental health crisis, usually it's the police officers, fire department, and the ambulances. Does Union City do the same exact thing? Utilize all those vehicles and people for a crisis?
It depends. Typically, when we get the initial call, police responds to determine if the individual meets the criteria for the 72-hour detention. If the person meets the criteria and there is no other medical need, we only request an ambulance for transport. If the person does have a medical need or need to be treated immediately, we might request fire if they can get there sooner than the ambulance. And that's how we handle it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Steve, I really appreciate your willingness to hang with us. I did commit to the committee that you would be willing to take some questions. And what I know is that we have a couple of members of the public who have a couple of questions for you. If you can just hang with us for a few more moments. We've had some challenges with some of our hands up features, and tonight we do have a couple of questions that have come from the community that we'd like you to address, if you would. Would. Lauren, are they on the hands up feature, or how do we get to the questions?
So they sent it in via chat, Chief, and I'm just going to read their comments to you. I'll start with one. How about I'll let you respond, and then we'll move to the second one.
Okay.
So the first one says, for the proposed Union City budget for 2019-2020, Public Works was allocated around $4.2 million, Community Recreation Services with $3.9 million, Economic and Community Development received around $3.42 million, most of which, with the exception of Public Works, was reserved for salaries and benefits, not services. The police department similarly had a budget that was mostly used for salaries and benefits rather than services, but with a budget of around $25 million. You must see that this isn't sustainable, nor does it empower our community. I understand that each city is unique, but you must see these glaring discrepancies, not just in allocation of funds across government, but also within departments. I understand that service from the heart is the UCPD culture, but a hotel for a few nights, no matter how kind, will not solve long-term problems. Studies show that investing in communities reduces crime, so why can we not implement this data-proven practice? And this person says this is a question for the committee, not just the chief.
And what exactly is the question, Lauren? What is the question? I understand.
He said so studies
the budget disparities, but what is the question?
Yeah, so at the end of the statement, he said studies show that investing in communities reduces crime. So I think he's referring to the funds. So why can we not implement this data-proven practice?
I don't have a way to answer that. I think what would help first would be to see the data that he's referring to and understand what that research entails. But without that, I'm unable to comment on it.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to go to the final comment here. And so this is the final public comment that we received. Can he speak to how UCPD vets new hires to be sure they were not fired from another police department? And if any psychological testing is used to determine how deep the implicit bias, in parentheses, racism may be. Any demographic data regarding police stops as to how many Blacks or people of color are stopped compared to white. And this is from Ruth from Southern Alameda County, NAACP.
Okay, first off, when we do our backgrounds, one of the first things we do is we see if the person has applied or worked at other law enforcement agencies. When I say applied, if the person has gone through a process and has been a part of a background, what we do is we actually go and get, or our backgrounders go and get the background from the other agency they applied or worked, and we review that to see why they were let go, why they didn't pass the process. So we do and really investigate not only the general background of an individual, but where they've worked before, whether it's other law enforcement cities or where they've applied before. In regard to stop data, we currently do not have that data. The good news is the federal government has required through RIPA, which is Racial and Identity Profiling Act. It's a requirement for all law enforcement agencies to report that data to the federal government. We will go live with it around 2022 or 2023. It's a requirement, though, that all law enforcement agencies throughout the country are going to have to meet. And every agency will be reporting the same data into the same system. So the questions about how many stops of certain race or certain gender will be captured, and they'll be able to be reported in a consistent way.
Okay. Is that it, Lauren? Okay. So, Chief, thank you very much. I really appreciate your willingness to offer up some suggestions around reform. As you know, one of our responsibilities, this committee, is to come up with a set of recommendations for the City Council. And so as we do our final report and our work, some of the things that you suggested could very well be included, and we'd certainly like to engage you in a partnership with us around how we can reform the police in Union City. You did offer up some suggestions that have been talked about and presented to the committee. So you may be hearing from us again soon. We're not completely done with you yet, and I really appreciate your willingness to partner with us to get this right on behalf of our community. So thank you so much for giving us all of this time. We really appreciate your coming and being with us and taking those 7 pages of questions that we had for you. So thank you so much, Chief. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. So we have, I think, completed our public comments also, which would have been next on our agenda, unless there are other comments that you see, Lauren, that would be under this section. Have we addressed public comments at this point?
We did get a few more, but it seems that the person in the attendance is okay if we just pass along the questions and just to put them on our radar.
So we'll include them in the data that we're analyzing as opposed to sending them off to the chief. That'll be good. Okay, we do keep all of these comments and we will be summarizing our recommendations. So at this point, we're at the good of the order, and I just want to remind the committee that we will not be meeting next week, but the committee staff will begin to pull together all of the recommendations, comments, begin to work on what might look like a staff report so that we can bring something back to this committee on the 27th for your review and editing or adding to. That will be an opportunity for us all to look together at the beginnings of what we want to take to the City Council. So we've scheduled it as a working session. And in order to help us put that together, we have asked that those of you that have notes and have been keeping track of recommendations and thoughts that you have, if you could send them to us, you can send them to Lauren or Emma or me directly. And what we'd like to do is to include your thoughts in the working document that we put together and bring back to you on the 27th. We are scheduled to get with the City Council the second meeting in September with our recommendations and suggestions as to how we move forward to our next steps here. So I think I mentioned there's no meeting next week. Our next meeting is on the 27th. It will be a working meeting, and we would really like to receive your comments so that we can work on those during the week that we're not having a meeting. So before we wrap up, I just want to take this opportunity for good of the order to see if there's anything that's on your mind that we haven't had an opportunity to hear or you haven't had an opportunity to say before we wrap up our meeting tonight. Alyssa, I see your hand.
Yes, I have a question about your schedule, the schedule. So the 27th is a working meeting, but it looks like we also will meet September 3rd before the City Council meeting. So will that also be a second working meeting? So we have 2 working meetings before the City Council meeting?
At this point, we only have the 27th scheduled. We haven't scheduled a follow-up meeting on the 3rd of September. If we need one, we certainly have the flexibility to do that, but there is a timeline that we have to follow to get this to the City Council. So we're hoping to wrap it up on the 27th.
Yeah, and Vice Mayor, I was just gonna to let everybody know here that Emma and myself will probably be taking most September evenings to do Measure WW presentations to the community. And so really we'll have to start shifting a lot of the work we're doing too. So we want to be able to do our due diligence in pulling things together to support this committee closer to the end of the month.
Okay.
Did that answer your question, Melissa?
Yes, it did.
Okay. So Pat, do you have any final good of the order thoughts you'd like to share?
No, my brain is empty, Emily. I've been meeting all day today, so I don't have anything to add anymore. But
Okay.
thank you for asking. Same thing with Lauren and other staff. So no, thank you. Of course.
What about you, Jonathan? Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I don't have anything for good of the order. I do have one quick question. For the notes of the recommendations, when do you want those back to staff by?
Well, we'd like to have them by, I think the date we had was the 18th
Yep.
of August.
Okay.
We'd like to have them by the 18th, which will give us time to put them together and begin to work on a project to bring back to you.
Okay, great.
Okay. Michelle, do you have any good of the order thoughts you'd like to make as we wrap up today?
No, that was the question that I was going to ask. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, we'd like to have those comments in by the 18th. You can send them, as I mentioned, to Emma, Lauren, or if you'd like to, you can send them to me. We all work together as a team here to staff you, so we'll all see them. So I just want to thank those in the public that have hung out with us tonight, who've had the opportunity to hear from our chief, and would encourage you, if you have some additional thoughts you'd like to send us, we're still taking comments and input up until that meeting on the 27th. So if you didn't get an opportunity to share those, please don't hesitate to send them to us. Okay, I think that we're done here. Thank you all for being with us tonight, and this meeting is adjourned.
Okay, thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.